In 1944, at the height of the Second World War, Caterpillar Tractor Company made a quiet announcement that ended two partnerships at once. The company would begin building its own blades, scrapers, and controls after the war, and it would no longer need the two suppliers whose equipment hung on the front of nearly every Caterpillar tractor in the world. One of those suppliers was R.G. LeTourneau of Peoria, and we have already told you how he fought his way back. The other was a company from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, whose name has been erased so completely that even videos about forgotten Dozer brands leave it out, even though it built the first commercially produced bulldozers and put hydraulics on crawler tractors 3 decades before hydraulics took over the industry. LeTourneau survived the CUT. LaPlant-Choate did not. Over the next 35 minutes, we are going to walk through the whole story in order, from a house mover in Marshalltown, Iowa in 1889, through the contested birth of the bulldozer, through the hydraulic gamble that was 30 years too early, through the war, the cut itself, the 8-year fight to survive, and the day in September 1952 when everything left in Cedar Rapids was repainted Persian orange. By the end, you will know exactly why one company lived and one company died, and why every operator on Earth still uses a word this dead company invented. The story starts with a man moving houses. In 1889, a contractor named E.W. LaPlant went into business in Marshalltown, Iowa, jacking up wooden houses, rolling them to new foundations, and pulling tree stumps out of Iowa farm ground. We should be honest with you right at the start about what the record holds. The written history of this company preserves its machines in remarkable detail, but it is oddly silent about the two men who built it. We searched for birth dates, death dates, and burial records for E.W. LaPlant and could not establish them from any reliable source. Even his full first name does not appear in the surviving documents, only the initials. What we do know is that his business worked. House moving in the 1890s meant capstans, screw jacks, timber cribbing, and teams of horses walking in circles to wind cable onto drums. Pulling stumps meant the same tools turned against oak roots. LaPlant built much of that equipment himself, and other contractors started asking to buy it. In 1911, his nephew Roy Choate joined him, and the two men incorporated LaPlant-Choate Manufacturing Company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, building stump pullers and house-moving machinery for sale. The Cedar Rapids Gazette later described how the company evolved under Choate's leadership into the business of manufacturing bulldozer and snowplow blades, and Choate himself settled into a home on Vernon Drive Southeast that still stands in the city today. A local surviving catalog from the House Movers Supply Company, with a portrait of E.W. LaPlant inside the cover, shows exactly where this empire of earth moving actually began, with jacks and rollers and cable winches for dragging Victorian houses down Iowa streets. The archives even connect the company's equipment to one genuinely famous lift, the old Illinois State House in Springfield, the building where Abraham Lincoln once argued cases, raised on jacks and cribbing during its Reconstruction era, by a moving contractor using this kind of gear. A firm that started under Iowa farmhouses was already learning the one lesson that would define its future. Weight is just a problem, and every problem has a machine. Then came the machine that changed everything, and here we need to slow down, because the question of who built the first bulldozer is one of the most contested claims in construction history, and this small Iowa company sits at the center of it. The Historical Construction Equipment Association records a claim that in 1920, LaPlant-Choate fitted a fixed dozer blade to a crawler tractor working the city garbage dump in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That blade could not be raised or lowered at all. It simply flipped up and dragged when the tractor backed away from the fill. The Cedar Rapids Gazette reports a different milestone, the first bulldozer manufactured and built on a commercial basis, produced by LaPlant-Choate in 1923 for work on the Dixie Highway in Kentucky. and a surviving photograph documents a LaPlant-Choate blade with a hand crank lift mounted on a Holt T-35 tractor in 1924, a full year before Holt and Best even merged to form Caterpillar. 3 dates, 3 machines, and an honest historian has to give you all 3 rather than pick a favorite. Now, some of you will remember our video on the first bulldozer blade ever built, the one about 2 Kansas farmers, a patent, and a blade steadied with oak planks. Their patent was filed in 1923 and approved in 1925, and it is the claim most often repeated online. But the Australian operator DS-Plant, a man with more than 50 years on dozers whose corrections have appeared under our own videos, has publicly pushed back on that story. His argument is simple. Those 2 inventors never actually manufactured a bulldozer for sale. They mounted a blade on a farm tractor to backfill a pipeline trench. LaPlant-Choate, by contrast, put dozer blades into regular commercial production and sold them across the country. Invention is one thing, an industry is another, and the industry, by that measure, started in Cedar Rapids. If you enjoy documentaries that take the time to get these details right, subscribe to Construction Legends. We cover the machines and the companies that built the modern world, and the archive grows every single week. By 1927, the company had moved far beyond hand cranks, and this is where the story turns into something bigger than blades. Because in the late 1920s, LaPlant-Choate placed a bet that would eventually win the entire earth-moving industry, and it placed that bet 30 years before the payout arrived. The bet was hydraulics. We need to correct our own record here. In our episode on 1950s bulldozers, we told you that hydraulic technology existed in the 1940s, but was not yet reliable enough for heavy equipment. That statement was wrong by roughly 2 decades, and several of you said so in the comments. The trade record shows that the hydraulically operated dozers and scrapers of today rest on experience LaPlant-Choate began accumulating as far back as 1927. By around 1929, the company was printing catalogs for a hydraulic angle dozer, it called the snow dozer, built to fit the Caterpillar 2-ton, the 15, the 20, the 30, and the 60. Read that list again. Factory hydraulic blade control offered for sale on Caterpillar tractors, while Herbert Hoover was still in his first year in the White House. The engineering behind that early lead deserves a closer look, because it explains why LaPlant-Choate hydraulics earned a reputation for surviving when competitors' systems failed. Most rival manufacturers built their hydraulic pumps around vanes, and vanes wore out fast on the dirty, inconsistent hydraulic oil available on job sites of that era. LaPlant-Choate built gear-type pumps instead, and it added a filter in the return line to the tank, a simple safeguard that kept grit from being pumped back through the system on every cycle. The gear pumps wore at a much slower rate. The filters caught what the oil carried, and contractors noticed. The product line grew into a full alphabet of equipment for Caterpillar iron. The B2 hydraulic straight dozer fit the Cat 15, 20, and 22. The B2D fit the D2. The B4 and B4X fit the 30, the RD4 and the D4. The B6 series fit the RD6 and D6, and the B8 fit the biggest tractors Peoria made, the 70 class and the RD8. The company sold its hydraulic control system under the name High Lift, and its cable-operated angle dozers under the name Trail Builder. We should also be fair to the men who chose cable in those years, because they were not fools. Hydraulic oil in the 1920s and 30s was inconsistent. Seals leaked in the cold, and a cable you could inspect with your own eyes felt safer than pressure you could not see. The most famous holdout was R.G. LeTourneau himself, the man whose name will shadow this entire story. LeTourneau built his empire on electric motors and steel cable. and he kept building cable control units long after the rest of the industry had surrendered to pressure and pistons. So picture the American job site of 1935 honestly. On one side of the cut, a cat pulling a LeTourneau carryall on cables. On the other side, a cat wearing a LaPlant-Choate high-lift blade on hydraulics. The two philosophies worked the same dirt for 20 years, and the argument between them would not be settled until both companies had paid a terrible price for the answer. And here is a detail that tells you everything about how tangled this industry really was. LaPlant-Choate never built its own cable power control unit. For its cable equipment, it bought the winch units from other manufacturers, including Garwood, Isaacson, and R.G. LeTourneau himself. A surviving parts catalog shows a LaPlant-Choate R76F trail builder angle dozer on a CAT D7, raised and lowered by a LeTourneau front power unit. The two companies that Caterpillar would one day cut off on the same decision were, in the 1930s, quite literally bolted to the same tractor. By 1939, LaPlant-Choate was a thriving concern and a major supplier of equipment to Caterpillar, both cable and hydraulic, sold and serviced through Caterpillar's worldwide dealer network. That dealer network is the single most important detail in this entire story. Remember it. The company from Cedar Rapids had the products, the patents, and the engineering, but the men who sold and serviced its equipment worked for Caterpillar dealers, not for LaPlant-Choate. As long as the partnership held, that arrangement was a gift. The moment it broke, it was a death sentence. In 1941, the partnership produced a genuine first. That year, Caterpillar introduced the DW-10, its first rubber-tired wheel tractor, and it needed a scraper to go behind it. LaPlant-Choate designed the CW-10, a 10 cubic yard hydraulic Carrimor, and the Historical Construction Equipment Association credits it as the first scraper ever designed specifically for a Caterpillar prime mover. LeTourneau offered a competing bowl for the same tractor, the DLS, and the market delivered a verdict that must have stung in Peoria's favorite neighborhood. Fewer than 20 DW-10 tractors were ever delivered with the LeTourneau scraper. Nearly everyone chose the LaPlant-Choate. Then the war came, and the little factory in Cedar Rapids went to war with it. This chapter of the story has almost never been told on this platform, and it is the part we most want you to remember. When the United States Army needed a bulldozer blade that could be mounted on a Sherman tank, the engineer board did not design one itself. It asked the two companies that knew blades best, and both LeTourneau and LaPlant-Choate built pilot tank dozer kits at their own expense. In June 1943, both designs were tested at Fort Pierce, Florida. The LeTourneau blade was cable-operated and standardized as the M1 mounting. The LaPlant-Choate blade was hydraulic and standardized as the M2. Think about what that means. The great cable versus hydraulic argument that would define post-war earthmoving was fought in miniature on the hull of the same Sherman tank, and the Army took both answers. The blades could be jettisoned by the driver in about 10 seconds if the tank had to fight. And when the tank dozers reached combat in Italy, crews at Anzio used them for a job nobody in Cedar Rapids ever imagined: smothering burning ammunition dumps with pushed earth. Engineer records from the Italian campaign describe tank dozers filling anti-tank ditches under fire, shoving wrecked vehicles off narrow roads, and cutting gun positions into hillsides, while ordinary unarmored dozers waited in the rear. And the men doing that work were protected by armor plate and a blade designed in an Iowa river town. In November 1944, LaPlant-Choate was proud enough of its Sherman work to take out an advertisement in Army Ordnance magazine showing the M4 tank wearing its hydraulic blade. The airborne story is stranger still. The Army Air Forces needed earth-moving equipment light enough to be loaded into gliders and cargo planes, flown over enemy lines, and put to work carving runways out of jungle. LaPlant-Choate built the Kiab series of hydraulic pull scrapers, including the Kiab 361, sized to pair with the small Clark CA-1 airborne crawler tractor. On the night of March 5, 1944, more than 30 Waco gliders came down in a jungle clearing in Burma that Allied planners had codenamed Broadway, carrying men, pack mules, and airborne engineering equipment. In less than a day, the engineers carved out a working airstrip 300 feet wide and 5,000 feet long, and transport planes were landing behind Japanese lines. How many of those little Clark CA-1 tractors were actually built is a question the sources genuinely disagree on, and we will give you the honest spread rather than a fake certainty. One museum states that more than 1,500 were used by the United States Army. Other accounts put total production far higher, and a commonly cited order history lists an initial batch of pilot machines, followed by an order for 800 more. Somewhere between 1,500 and roughly 2,500 is the defensible range, and the same airborne combinations later appeared in the buildup behind the Normandy beaches. What is not in dispute is what hung behind them. The scraper that made the little tractor useful was built in Cedar Rapids, weighed roughly 1.25 tons, and rolled into a C-47 in one piece. A military vehicle collector in Oregon who owns one today documented his restoration on a public forum, and machines from that same airborne family now sit in an Iowa museum collection, which we will come back to at the end of this story. For a company that had started under Iowa farmhouses, this was the strangest chapter imaginable. Its smallest scraper went to war by air, and its biggest blades went to war welded to 30-ton tanks. Company records also list tree dozer land clearing blades for the D7 and D8, mine clearing dozers, and photographs of a Cat D8 wearing a LaPlant-Choate hydraulic angle dozer clearing wrecked wagons from the rubble of Coutances in Normandy in the summer of 1944. And thanks to a family obituary, we know one voice from inside the factory during those years. Records show that Emily Wagner, a young woman in the bookkeeping department, spent the war handling military orders, and her family wrote after her passing that she never stopped telling stories about the pressure of filling them. To be clear with you, that account comes to us through her obituary, not a recorded interview, and that is exactly how we will treat every piece of testimony in this video. When we quote a person, we will tell you exactly where the words come from, because in that same year, 1944, while LaPlant-Choate scrapers were landing in Burma by glider and its blades were riding on Shermans toward Germany, Caterpillar decided the partnership was over. Every documentary we make takes days of research through archives, forum threads, and county records like these. You can help us keep going by leaving a small donation. Just click the link in the description and support us. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because the second half of this story is the reason we made this video. The decision itself was not a secret, and it was not personal. The industry historian William Haycraft, who spent his career inside Caterpillar, recorded the reasoning in plain language. In 1944, Caterpillar announced that after the war, it would begin producing its own blades, buckets, scrapers, and other cable and hydraulic control detachments, because the company was determined that it would no longer be dependent on other manufacturers to supply those essential and profitable items. Essential and profitable, that is the entire motive, written down by the company's own historian, and we do not need to invent a villain when the record hands us the reasoning in one sentence. You may have seen other documentaries date this break to 1942. The documented announcement that ended both supplier relationships came in 1944, and that date matters, because it means the cut arrived while LaPlant-Choate equipment was still landing on invasion beaches under Caterpillar paint. Both suppliers lost the same thing on the same decision: access to Caterpillar's worldwide dealer network. What happened next depended entirely on what each company had built outside that network, And this is where the two stories split forever. R.G. LeTourneau had spent 15 years preparing for a fight he may never have expected, and he did not even fully realize it. He had his own factories in Peoria, in Toccoa, Georgia, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in Rydalmere, Australia, and soon in Longview, Texas. He had his own independent dealer organization selling under his own name. He held hundreds of patents, and his plants were swollen with war contracts. The Texas State Historical Association records that LeTourneau supplied about 70% of all the earth-moving equipment used by the Allied forces, roughly 8,000 scrapers and 14,000 dozer blades, among much more. You will sometimes hear a figure of 95% in other videos. The documented figure from the historical record is 70, and 70 is astonishing enough. One more piece of honesty belongs here, because his machines were never as independent from Caterpillar as the legend claims. Out on the job sites, his famous LeTourneau scrapers were loaded with tracked push tractors behind them, and more often than not, the machine doing the pushing wore Caterpillar yellow. The two companies needed each other right up until the day Peoria decided otherwise. LaPlant-Choate had none of that armor. One factory in Cedar Rapids. No dealer network of its own, because for years, Caterpillar dealers had been its sales force, its parts counter, and its service department, all at once. The trade press later summarized the aftermath in a single brutal line. When Cat pulled the plug, it collapsed LaPlant's distribution overnight, and building a new sale, parts, and service network from scratch takes years of time and enormous amounts of capital. The company had to spend its war profits not on new machines, but on rebuilding the ability to sell machines at all. Every dollar that went into signing independent dealers was a dollar that never reached the engineering department, and the company was now competing for those dealers against LeTourneau, against International Harvester, and soon against Caterpillar's own attachment division, built specifically to replace it. So the men in Cedar Rapids did the only thing a machine company can do when its old market disappears. They designed a machine for a new one. Even before the cut was final, a prototype was running in the yard in 1944, a self-propelled motor scraper in the mold of the LeTourneau, and by July 1945, it was fully operational. In 1946, the production machine arrived, and the sources disagree slightly on the timing, with one trade article placing full production in 1947, so we will give you both. It was called the TS-300, an 18 cubic yard machine, and it made LaPlant-Choate only the fourth manufacturer in the United States to build a true motor scraper. The company even coined a trademark for the concept: first Moto-Scraper, then Motor Scraper. Sit with that for a moment. Motor Scraper, the generic term that every operator, every auction listing, and every equipment manual on Earth uses today, began its life as a brand name owned by a company almost nobody remembers. The towed scrapers in the catalog carried a name with even more attitude. LaPlant-Choate called them Carrimors, a direct shot at LeTourneau, whose scrapers were famously called carryalls. Two companies cut loose by the same customer in the same year, still throwing punches at each other in their product names. The TS-300 itself deserves the specification sheet treatment, because several of you have told us in the comments that you want the numbers, not just the story. The standard engine was a supercharged Buda diesel, Model 6 DCS 844, rated at 225 flywheel horsepower. From 1950, buyers could order a Cummins NHS 600 rated at 275 horsepower or a bigger supercharged Buda rated at 280 horsepower. Power went through a 17-inch Lippe rollway dry clutch into a 4-speed Fuller manual transmission, good for about 18 miles per hour loaded. Steering was hydraulic through an arc of about 60 degrees, and the hydraulics ran off the company's own HU-40 gear pump moving 40 gallons per minute. And the bowl carried the company's signature, a curved floor and curved cutting edge that loaded far more aggressively than the flat edges on competing scrapers. That curve is not marketing talk. Collectors who still pull these machines wrote in a farming forum thread that we will link below that their LaPlant-Choate pans load easy compared to a lot of others, and one Iowa owner of an 8-yard model reported that after roughly 60 years of work, his machine had 0 fatigue cracks because there was an adequate amount of steel in them. Those are collector accounts from a public forum, not our words, and they match the engineering record. The same honest record forces us to show you the machine's dark side. On the TS-300, the cables that raised and lowered the bowl were routed along the draft yoke, disturbingly close to the back of the operator's head. If a hoist cable snapped at that point under load, the whiplash could kill the man in the seat, and the trade press stated plainly that it could decapitate him. Allis-Chalmers, which would soon inherit the design, did not reroute that cable until 1958. Collectors restoring these machines today still warn each other about the related ejector cable, which destroys the ejector cylinder if it slacks or breaks under modern hydraulic pressure. 1940s earthmoving did not forgive design shortcuts, and we owe you the truth about this one. For a few years, the gamble looked like it might work. By 1948, the Cedar Rapids Gazette could report that the city's road machinery industry employed 5,000 people and shipped $52 million of equipment a year, and we owe you the fine print on that number, because it covers the city's whole industry, including the crusher builders at Iowa Manufacturing, not LaPlant-Choate alone. But it tells you what was at stake on First Avenue. In 1950, the company added the TS-200, a 13 cubic yard machine, and on that one the engineers finally got their wish. All hydraulic operation, no killer cable anywhere near the operator. The hydraulic pioneers had built the hydraulic motor-scraper their whole history pointed toward. A rubber-tired push tractor called the TD-300 failed quickly, with only a handful built, but the scrapers sold and worked. A contractor named Ralph Mills ran a TS-300 on the Island Creek Dam job, and the company put the photograph in its advertising. We are now at the final act, and if this story of one company's fight has been worth your time so far, take 1 second and hit subscribe, because stories like this one are the reason this channel exists, and we are about to show you the coldest single fact in it. And here it is. Caterpillar needed a scraper for its DW-10 wheel tractor after cutting off both of its scraper suppliers. So in 1947, Peoria introduced its own, the Caterpillar number 10. Look at a photograph of that machine's bowl, and then look at the LaPlant-Choate CW-10 it replaced. The number 10 carried a curved cutting edge, similar in design to the CW-10 that had just been discontinued. Caterpillar had ended the partnership, and then its first scraper borrowed the signature feature of the partner it ended. Nothing in the record suggests anything illegal, and good ideas travel in every industry. But if you ever wondered whether Cedar Rapids engineering left a mark on the yellow iron that conquered the world, there is your answer, pressed into the dirt by every pass of a number 10. By the early 1950s, the arithmetic was closing in. LaPlant-Choate had good machines, roughly 866 TS-300 units built and sold, a growing TS-200, and a dealer network still years away from paying for itself. It was a small company fighting Caterpillar, LeTourneau, International, and Euclid all at once, with one factory and thinning capital. In September 1952, it ended. Allis-Chalmers of Milwaukee bought the entire company, the Cedar Rapids plant, the tooling, the patent rights, the trademarks, and every unsold machine in the yard. The purchase price has never appeared in any public record we could find, and we will not invent a number for you. For scale, the record does show what the survivor got 1 year later. In 1953, LeTourneau sold his earth-moving line to Westinghouse Air Brake for a reported $31 million and a 5-year agreement to stay out of the business. The pioneer of hydraulic earth-moving received an undisclosed sum and disappeared. The evangelist of cable control received a reported $31 million, and a university that still carries his name. Allis-Chalmers kept the model numbers, kept the curved cutting edge, and repainted everything in its signature Persian orange. The TS-300 stayed in the catalog until 1954, when its tractor was redesigned into the TS-360, and the TS-200 became the TS-260 2 years later. Counting the Persian orange machines, total TS-300 production reached about 1,070 units. Allis-Chalmers bought the Buddha Engine Company in 1953 and quietly dropped the Cummins option. Piece by piece, badge by badge, the name LaPlant-Choate faded off the iron, until the only place it survived was cast into hydraulic pump housings and stamped on reservoir caps, where restorers still find it today. The factory outlived the name by decades, and this is where the human voices come in, clearly labeled, exactly as we promised. Mike Woolrab of Mount Vernon, Iowa, worked in that plant from 1963 to 1967 under Allis-Chalmers, handling painting, assembly, and parts. And he told the Cedar Rapids Gazette in 2011 what the work was really like. He remembered dousing himself in lacquer thinner to strip paint overspray off his own skin and shivering through Iowa winters inside a steel building that had no insulation at all. He also defended the machines to the end, telling the paper the products were far ahead of the competition on technology, and that they came from just a small plant, competing with big outfits like Caterpillar. His words, on the record, from a man who stood on that floor. The obituary pages of Cedar Rapids fill in the rest of the workforce. Records show Lester Petrak spent 41 years in that plant as a machinist and welder, a member of United Auto Workers Local 1316, rising to practical engineer by retirement. Leland Nowatzki gave the plant 37 years across all 3 owners. Alfred Hotchkiss gave it 42 as a machinist. A secretary named Pauline Ollinger served the original company for many years. These were not jobs. They were whole working lives. 3 and 4 decades long, spent inside one building on First Avenue. That building kept making things under Allis-Chalmers and then under Harnisch-Fager until July 1989. And the symmetry of that date stops us cold every time we read it. E.W. LaPlante started moving houses in 1889. The last machine work in his factory ended 100 years later, almost to the year. The empty plant stood for 2 more decades. When a Cedar Rapids company called Raining Rose bought the site to build a new factory, its chief executive walked visitors through the silent halls under 35-foot ceilings and called the place an industrial cathedral, and his crews salvaged the great steel-framed windows for their new conference room. A general contractor working the site said that every single week someone stopped to tell him they had worked there, or that their father had. In 2011, the cathedral came down. One report from the demolition era, which we could not fully verify and are flagging for you as unconfirmed, says the excavation crews unearthed an old dozer buried in the ground of the site itself and set it out front. A machine factory, demolished by machines, giving up one last machine from its own soil. So what actually remains of LaPlant-Choate today? A Cab Series airborne scraper and a Clark CA-1 crawler sit in a museum collection in Clarion, Iowa. A collector in Stockholm restored a Caterpillar 22 wearing a LaPlant-Choate blade. Farmers in Alabama, Iowa, and Minnesota still pull Carrimor pans behind modern tractors and post about them online, comparing notes on 4-yard and 8-yard bulls that have outlived 3 generations of the companies that built, bought, and buried the name on their reservoir caps. And one thing more, the biggest thing of all. Hydraulics won. Every excavator, every dozer, every scraper built anywhere on Earth today runs on the technology this company bet on in 1927, 30 years before the industry agreed. The cable systems that beat them in the market are museum pieces. The company that was right too early got an unmarked grave, and the phrase Moto-Scraper, their own trademark, became so universal that the world forgot it ever belonged to anyone. Caterpillar cut off both of its suppliers in 1944. The one with 5 factories survived. The one with the better idea did not. History does not always pay the inventor, but it does keep the receipts, and now you have seen them. If your father or grandfather worked at that plant on First Avenue, or if you ever ran a Carrimor, a trail builder, or a TS-300, tell us in the comments, because we read every one, and the operators in our comment section have already corrected this channel more than once and made it better every time. And if you want the other half of this story, the man who survived the 1944 cut, watch our episode on R.G. LeTourneau, the inventor with 299 patents that Caterpillar laughed at, right here on Construction Legends. Subscribe, and we will keep digging these companies out of the ground, one forgotten name at a time.